I had always prided myself on keeping a cool, analytical distance from my patients. In neurology, emotion could cloud judgment, and precision was everything. But when the case of a man with sudden, violent behavior crossed my desk, I knew this would be different. He was referred to me after a string of uncontrollable outbursts that left both his family and his former doctor baffled. He was polite during our first session, his hands folded neatly in his lap, but there was something about his eyes that unsettled me, something hollow, as though the person I was speaking to was just a shell, and something else was watching from the shadows within. I delved into his history, reviewed his charts. The scans were clean. No lesions, no abnormalities, no sign of neurological damage that could explain his outbursts. Yet, as I continued our sessions, the behavior became more erratic. He described feeling detached from his own body, as if watching himself from outside, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. His accounts grew darker, talking about shadows that whispered to him, urging him to do terrible things. I tried to remain rational, explaining it as some form of psychosis or delusional disorder, but deep down, I felt a chill. This wasn't a typical case. The man became violent during one session, smashing a chair against the wall. His face twisted in a grotesque mask of rage before collapsing, confused and horrified by his own actions. His body trembled as he begged me to find out what was wrong with him. As a doctor, I had to remain professional, but as I watched him struggle, my heart raced. Something wasn't right, not with him, not with the situation, and not with me. As I began to dedicate more time to this case, I found myself thinking about it constantly. I spent long nights in my office reviewing his file, poring over every detail in search of something I had missed. At first, it seemed like the stress of the work was catching up to me. I started noticing little things, my reflection lingering in the mirror, a second too long, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye when no one else was in the room. But then the dreams began. Vivid, unnerving dreams where I walked through endless hallways, the walls closing in, the air thick and suffocating. Faceless figures followed me, their eyes glowing in the darkness, murmuring in a strange guttural language. I would wake up gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. The images burned into my mind. I dismissed it as stress, lack of sleep, the inevitable toll of handling such a high-stakes case. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the infection, if that's what it was, wasn't just affecting him. It was creeping into me. The patient's behavior worsened. He spoke of the shadows more frequently now, of the voices that commanded him, of the violent urges that surged through him uncontrollably. He swore the infection was spreading, that I would feel it too. I laughed it off at first, but there was a part of me that wondered if he was right. I began losing time. I'd wake up in strange places, the break room, the hospital stairwell, unsure of how I got there. My colleagues started commenting on my appearance, the dark circles under my eyes, the hollow look in my face. I didn't tell them about the dreams or the visions that plagued me even during waking hours. How could I explain that I was seeing the same figures my patient described? One night, I stayed late at the clinic, determined to crack this case. I was reviewing a series of brain scans when I noticed something off. A tiny anomaly, almost imperceptible, nestled deep in the temporal lobe of my patient's brain. I zoomed in, studying the image with growing dread. Whatever it wasn't natural. It wasn't something I had ever seen before. As I stared at the scan, a voice whispers my name. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. My skin prickled with fear as I realized the voice wasn't external, it was inside my head. I rushed out of the clinic, my mind racing. Had I caught something from the patient? Was it possible for an infection to spread through proximity, through observation? It sounded absurd, but my hands trembled as I locked my office door, afraid of what I might see if I stayed. The following days were a blur. I conducted more tests on my patient, but he was deteriorating rapidly. He barely recognized me anymore, his eyes wild with fear, his skin pale and clammy. I isolated myself in the lab, running every possible test I could think of on my own blood, searching for any sign of the infection within me, but there was nothing. No virus, no bacteria, nothing physical that I could identify. I became consumed by the idea that the infection was not biological. It was something more, something insidious, intangible. It preyed on the mind, fed on fear and obsession. I started to believe that the only way to stop it was to remove the part of my brain where it had taken root. I prepared for the surgery myself, my hands shaking as I sterilized the tools. I had done countless procedures before, but this was different. This was personal. I stood in front of the mirror, scalpel in hand, tracing the path I would take. But as the blade neared my skin, the shadows gathered in the corners of the room, watching. I froze, feeling their gaze on me. And suddenly I understood. The infection wasn't something I could cut out. It wasn't in my brain, it was in my soul. I dropped the scalpel and stumbled back, the room spinning. The infection was inside me, yes, but it had never been physical. It had been feeding on my fear, my obsession, growing stronger with every sleepless night, every moment I spent trying to solve the case. I realized with horror that my patient hadn't been the first. The infection had passed through others, and I had unwittingly let it latch onto me. I fled the hospital that night, leaving everything behind: my patient, my career, my life. I couldn't stay. The infection would continue to spread if I remained. I thought about going to the authorities, but how could I explain what had happened? They'd lock me away in a psychiatric ward, treat me like I was crazy. Maybe I was. I now live in isolation, far from the city, far from anyone who might come into contact with me. I hear the whispers at night, see the shadows lurking at the edges of my vision. They never leave me alone. But I know the truth now: the infection doesn't die. It lingers, waiting for the next host, waiting for the moment when fear will crack their mind open and let it in. I write this as a warning. If you ever find yourself trapped in a case you can't solve, if you start to see things that shouldn't be there, hear voices that aren't real, stop, run. Don't let the infection take you, because once it does, it will never let go. I always imagined I'd have more time, more years to do everything I hadn't yet done: to travel, to fall in love, to live. But those hopes evaporated the day the doctor gave me the news: stage 4, terminal. There were no treatment options left. They said it as if they were offering condolences for something far off, but I could see it in their eyes. I was as good as dead. That night, I sat in my apartment, the sterile smell of a hospital still clinging to my clothes. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I thought about calling my family, but what could I say? How do you tell people that you're going to die? Then the email came, a message in my inbox from a medical research facility I had never heard of. The subject line read, "A second chance." I opened it. They were offering an experimental treatment, something cutting edge that wasn't available to the public yet. Desperate for any shred of hope, I called the number listed. The voice on the other end was calm, clinical. They explained that the treatment was risky, still in the trial phase, but it had shown promising results in a select group of patients. I didn't ask too many questions. What did I have to lose? The next morning, I was on my way to their facility, tucked away in the outskirts of the city. The facility didn't look like any hospital I'd been to. It was modern, sleek, with white walls that seemed to hum with a strange energy. They ushered me in quickly, running a battery of tests that seemed unnecessary, given how little time I supposedly had left. Doctor, a tall, thin man with cold blue eyes, explained that the treatment would involve a series of injections designed to simulate cellular regeneration. It sounded like science fiction. I didn't care about the details. I signed the papers, and they began the injections that same afternoon. At first, nothing seemed to change. I felt the needle go in, felt the cool rush of the liquid entering my bloodstream, but otherwise I was the same. The doctors assured me this was normal. It would take time for the treatment to start working, they said. By the third day, though, those began to shift. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. My muscles ached, and my skin felt tight, as though it were stretched too thin over my bones. When I looked in the mirror, I noticed something strange. My pupils were dilated, so much so that my eyes appeared black. The ache in my limbs spread, twisting into sharp, stabbing pains. I told the doctors the next day, but they brushed it off. Side effects, they said. It means the treatment is working. But I knew something was wrong. I could feel it deep inside me like a sickness that was spreading. Dull pain intensified, becoming a constant companion. My skin started to change, 2 rough patches of it growing thick and scaly, almost like the hide of an animal. The doctors reassured me again, but their words no longer felt comforting. They felt like lies. By the second week, the changes were undeniable. My bones seemed to shift beneath my skin, my muscles twitching uncontrollably. I had to stay hidden, locked in my room at the facility, away from the other patients. My skin had grown tougher, almost impenetrable, and my reflection was barely recognizable. Scaly patches had spread across my body, and my eyes, they were no longer human. I could feel my body betraying me. My hands shook, and at times I couldn't control them. My breathing became labored, ragged, as if something inside me was growing too large for my body to contain. The whispers of doubt grew louder, and I began to question everything. What were they really doing to me? One night, I overheard 2 doctors talking outside my room. They mentioned something about subject stability and unexpected mutations. I realized then that I wasn't the first. This wasn't about curing me. This was an experiment, and I was nothing more than a test subject. Whatever they were injecting me with wasn't meant to heal me, it was turning me into something else. I couldn't stay any longer. I had to get out before I lost whatever humanity I had left. The night I decided to escape, the facility was eerily quiet. I had become stronger, whatever was happening to me. It had given me more strength than I had ever known. My once frail, sick body felt powerful, but it was a power that terrified me. It wasn't mine. I made my way through the halls, every step careful, avoiding the security cameras. The doctors didn't expect me to leave. Why would I? They thought they had control over me, but they didn't realize just how much I had changed. As I reached the exit, I saw something that stopped me cold. Through the glass doors of one of the rooms, I saw another patient, his body twisted and contorted and spat were inhuman. His eyes were wide, wild, and his mouth moved as though he was trying to scream, but no sound came out. It was then that I understood. I wasn't the only one they had experimented on. There were others, just like me, others who hadn't made it. I fought the urge to help him, knowing that if I stayed, I would end up like him. I forced myself to move, pushing through the doors and into the cold night air. The freedom felt foreign, almost wrong. I was out, but I wasn't safe. Not yet. I didn't stop running until I was miles away from the facility. The city's lights blurred around me, and my thoughts raced faster than my feet could carry me. My body had become something monstrous. My skin, once soft, was now thick and armored, my joints stiff, my bones aching as they continued to shift. I could feel the changes accelerating, as though my body was racing against time to complete whatever mutation the treatment had triggered. I stumbled into a dark alley, gasping for breath, the pain overwhelming. My vision blurred as I fell to my knees. The world around me spun, and for a moment I wondered if this was it, if this was how it would end. But as the darkness closed in, I felt something else, something far worse. The transformation wasn't done. My hands clawed at the pavement, my nails growing long and sharp. I could feel the last remnants of my humanity slipping away. My mind, once clear, was now clouded with strange animalistic instincts. I wanted to scream, but the sound that escaped my throat was a guttural, inhuman growl. I knew then that the cure had failed. I was no longer a man. I had become something else entirely. I don't know how long I lay there, caught between the person I used to be and the creature I had become. Time felt meaningless. My body was a prison, and my mind, once sharp and clear, was fractured. I was losing myself bit by bit to the monster they had created. But then, just as I thought I would be consumed entirely, I heard voices. Familiar voices. The doctors had found me. They surrounded me, their faces cold and clinical, the same way they had been when they first told me about the trial. But now I saw the truth behind their eyes. They had never been trying to save me. "And you've come a long way," the head doctor said, his voice void of emotion. "We didn't expect you to survive this long." I tried to speak, to demand answers, but my voice came out as a low growl. I was no longer capable of forming words. "You've done well," he continued, "but it's time to end this." The last thing I remember is the prick of a needle in my arm and the world fading to black. When I woke, I was back in the facility, strapped to a bed. My body no longer ached, and my skin was smooth once again. But I knew better. The monster was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it could take over again. I was their experiment, and I always would be. There is no escape. I didn't ask to be assigned to the night shift in the hospital's oldest, most forgotten wing. Yet, here I was, in Ward D, a place even the staff avoided. The hospital administration hadn't given me much of a choice. They claimed it was routine, part of my rotation, but the way they averted their eyes when I asked for more details made me uneasy. Ward D had earned itself a reputation over the years. It wasn't just the peeling walls or the flickering lights that gave it an eerie atmosphere, it was the stories. Stories about patients who had died only to come back different, violent, unrecognizable. These weren't just whispered rumors, they were documented cases, hidden away in hospital files that I wasn't supposed to see. Curiosity got the better of me, and I dug through those records. Each case followed the same pattern. The patient would flatline, be pronounced dead, and then, hours later, they would inexplicably return, heart beating, lungs breathing. But they were no longer the people they once were. Something inside them had changed, and now I was tasked with understanding why. On my first night, I made my rounds, feeling the weight of the silence in Ward D pressing in on me. The patients were few, each one in critical condition, hooked up to machines that did the work their bodies no longer could. Most of them were too far gone to notice my presence. Then I saw him, room 407. His chart said he had died 2 days ago. Staff had resuscitated him, which wasn't unusual in itself, but the notes in his file were vague. They didn't mention the things I had read in the other files, the things I knew were coming. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead, but there was something off in his gaze. Hollow, lifeless, despite the fact that he was breathing. I stepped closer, feeling a strange chill run down my spine. The man blinked slowly, then turned his head to face me. His lips curled into a grotesque, unnatural smile, and without warning, he lunged at me. His body, which should have been weak and frail, moved with terrifying strength. I barely managed to stumble backward, knocking over a tray of instruments in my haste. Nurses rushed in, sedating him quickly. He was dead, one of them whispered, as if it were a confession. He shouldn't be here. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with patients in critical condition. I was dealing with something far worse. The next few days passed in a haze of terror. Each night brought more strange incidents. Patients who were declared dead would suddenly rise, their behavior becoming erratic, violent. I began to investigate, searching for any clue that might explain what was happening in Ward D. The hospital administration was no help. They dismissed my concerns, claiming it was a medical anomaly, nothing more. But I knew better. Late one night, I found what I was looking for. Hidden in the back of the records room was a file labeled Project Revive. It was a clinical trial for an experimental drug designed to stimulate cellular regeneration in terminally ill patients. The drug was meant to bring them back from the brink of death, but it had never been approved for human testing, and yet somehow it had made its way into Ward D. The more I read, the more my stomach churned. The drug didn't just restart the heart and lungs, it did something far more sinister. It altered the brain, awakening primitive, violent instincts in those who received it. The patients weren't coming back to life, they were being reanimated, their humanity stripped away. I had to confront the head of the hospital. I demanded answers, but they were evasive, insisting that the experiment had been abandoned long ago. Yet the evidence was right in front of me. Patients in Ward D were being administered the drug without their consent, and now they were paying the price. That night, everything spiraled out of control. The air in Ward D felt heavy, as if the building itself knew something terrible was about to happen. I made my way down the darkened hall, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the stillness. As I approached room 407 again, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of labored breathing, followed by a deep, guttural growl. When I entered the room, the patient who had been sedated earlier was sitting upright, his eyes wide and bloodshot. His skin had taken on a sickly pallor, and his hands were clenched into tight fists. Before I could react, he threw himself off the bed, moving with a speed and agility that no dying man should possess. The others in the ward began to stir as well, their machines beeping wildly as they came back to life, one by one. It was as if the entire ward was awakening. The patients, once frail and helpless, were now filled with an unnatural energy, their eyes devoid of recognition. They were no longer human. I ran, heart pounding in my chest, as the reanimated patients filled the halls, their shrieks and growls echoing behind me. They weren't just attacking blindly, they were hunting. I barely made it to the exit, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the door. Behind me, the sounds of chaos grew louder. I could hear the screams of the nurses and doctors who had been caught off guard, their cries for help quickly silenced by the enraged creatures that had once been their patients. I didn't look back. Once outside, I found the head of the hospital waiting for me, flanked by security personnel. Their expressions were cold, emotionless. "You're too late," I spat, still panting from the adrenaline. "You've unleashed something you can't control." The head of the hospital didn't flinch. "We can contain it," they said, their voice eerily calm. "The experiment is necessary." I realized then that they never intended to stop the reanimations. The drug was too valuable, too groundbreaking. They were willing to sacrifice anyone, patients, staff, even me, to ensure its success. But I wasn't going to be their next victim. I had seen enough, and I knew that as long as Ward D existed, the horrors would continue. I made the decision to expose everything, to tell the world what was happening in the hospital's forgotten wing. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The patients in Ward D were still there, still reanimated. And as long as that drug existed, the line between life and death would never be clear again. I'm writing this from the safety of my apartment, but I know it won't last. Ward D has been sealed off, but it's only a matter of time before the truth gets out. I've seen what they've become, what I almost became. There's no stopping it now. The hospital will cover it up, just like they've done with every other patient who's risen from the dead. But I won't let them bury the truth. I'll tell my story, and maybe, just maybe, someone will listen before it's too late. Because once the dead start walking, it's only a matter of time before they come for the living. If you want to see more horror stories, please like the video, share your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us, thank you, and see you in the next videos.